Good afternoon. What are we doing here today? We're talking about place content. If you're not familiar with place content, then this might be a bit of a difficult session. Place content is technology that got added in pdfToolbox 8, so it is not even brand new anymore. It is very, very powerful and flexible, but it can be a bit of a challenge to get started with. And what I've tried to do in this session, we'll see whether I succeed to get through everything here. What I tried to do in this session is give you some pointers on how I have organized my work to do place content templates, and go through a number of examples, because there are, I think, a number of key things you have to realize when you start making a template that can make it much easier to get started from that point on. So let's get going here. How do you work with place content templates? Part of this will be presentation, but the presentation is mostly for me not to lose my way while I'm talking, and for you to refer to afterwards. So how to get started with place content templates? Well, the first thing is that you might try to avoid needing place content templates in the first place. If you don't have to create them, then they cannot be a problem. And that sounds really, really bad, but it's actually the first thing that I try to figure out if I need to build something, is whether I need to go as far as creating an HTML template to use in place content. Why would you not? Well, as you probably remember, there are, or as you should remember, if we go to pdfToolbox, and I can't resist to switch to the software immediately. If we go to pdfToolbox and I make a new fix-up, and in the find field I type place, you'll see that there are actually 4 fix-ups that show up, ranging from place text, place number, place barcode, and then you have place content. I would urge you to look at place content, at place text, page number, and barcode before you start thinking about building a place content template. Why? Because of course it's much easier to use place text and fill out some fields than it is to use place content and have to create an HTML template to use. So that's one thing that you should keep in mind, actually. Second point is that perhaps even if you think or you determine that you need to use place content, you should think about, is it possible to do this without an HTML template? And if you weren't at my presentation yesterday about pdfToolbox 9.1, this may be surprising, but if I go back to place content, what you expect here is that you have to select a folder, and that folder will be, when I open this up, that those folders will contain HTML. That's how the feature normally works. The HTML gets picked up and converted into PDF. That's what you expect. Well, actually, you can today also do this with SVG. So I can take an SVG file, call it index.svg, and in this 01 folder, for example, instead of all the stuff I have there right now, I could simply have an index.svg file, and then that will be picked up, it will be converted to PDF, and it will be placed in onto your PDF based on the parameters that you've specified here in pdfToolbox. And even though this is not fully supported yet, this will even work with some other file formats, very specifically with images. So if I take an image and place that in a folder, that will be picked up and used again. So that's a second way to avoid having to use a template. Of course, that's not why we're here. I assume that the reason you're in this webinar is because you've determined that you do want to have an HTML template, and you're interested in figuring out what those things can do and how it would be set up. So that's what we should be talking about from this point on. But I wanted to include that because it's important. If you can avoid it, it's always going to be easier to avoid it and use place text or place barcode instead. So we want to make an HTML template. Well, part of the work, of course, is going to be done in pdfToolbox itself. Creation of fix-ups is always going to happen inside of pdfToolbox. But of course, part of the work you need to do with these HTML templates. An HTML template for place content is nothing but a folder with HTML content in it. And how do you edit that? Well, you need something to edit HTML. And I'm not going to tell you what you should be using. It's a matter of taste and what you feel comfortable with, but I will tell you what I'm using because it makes a difference. And I think that the workflow I've set up both for pdfToolbox and pdfChip is relatively convenient at this point. So you can use anything that you want, but I'm using Sublime. Sublime is a Mac text editor. I'm actually not sure if it's cross-platform, so my apologies for the Windows people if it turns out to be only Mac. Sublime is a text editor, but it's a text editor with a few extras that are very useful. It is it looks very nice. It's very convenient to work with. It's a very fast text editor. Even if by accident you open up a PDF file with it, it's still not going to crash your system. It supports a lot of different syntaxes for syntax highlighting, which is kind of important because we're going to be using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and maybe some other stuff. So having syntax coloring for all of those is really nice. There are other plugins supported to do things like checking your JavaScript code for errors or for best practices and so on. But mainly what Sublime stands out for is the folders and the build system. Now, unfortunately, the build system we cannot really use for place content templates. That is something that we can use for pdfChip. But the folders are still very nice. And what do I mean with that? Well, in Sublime, you can open up a file, and then that gives you the syntax coloring and everything else. Let me make this a little bit bigger again as we go through this. So you just open up a file in Sublime. It shows that to you. The file itself is on the left-hand side. You can hide that if you want, but by default, that's where it's shown. And then you can drag in a folder for your templates. And you could say, well, I have one folder for a place content template, and then you have this HTML inside and so on. So you could just drag that folder in. What I usually do is something different. I drag in the folder that contains all of these templates in the library that I'm working with. And how would you do that? Well, if you go to Sublime, like I said, I can open up a file with that. So we'll just open that up in Sublime, and then I can grab the folder either of my templates and drag it in here on the left-hand side, and that will appear. Or I can drag the HTML templates folder as a whole, and then drag that in. And maybe I probably don't need this other one anymore in that case. So remove. And that gives me in one location, it gives me all of these different templates. That makes it easy to do copy-paste between templates, to check what you've done in something else, in some other templates. So you can open up the HTML templates folder that you use in the library that you're working with, and then everything is good. Now, once you've dragged the template folder in, you can then work with a project. And of course, I've already done that. So if I go to projects in Sublime and I say open recent, then it shows you a whole list of projects that you've saved and are working on. And I can simply open up this place content template again. That shows me all the folders I dragged in here initially. And also, if I have any open files that I was editing, even files that I was editing but have not saved yet, then those files will appear in the Open Files section. So that too is very convenient. Even if you're working on something, you're editing something, you can simply quit Sublime, and when you launch it afterwards, it still remembers your edits without saving the file that you were editing. So you can still change your mind and not save it at that point. So this folder support in Sublime is really very useful, and you don't have to limit yourself to only dragging in the HTML templates folder. Of course, you can add other folders in there. You can add folders with documentation, or what I often do is have a folder with test data for a particular project. You can open those as well, and you can have as many folders in there as you like. And then you save that as a project, and what that will do is it will save a Sublime project file and a Sublime workspace file. And workspace is how the different windows are laid out and so on. The project is the information about the files that you were editing and the folders that you were editing and so on. So as I said, that's one part of why I like Sublime. The other reason is the build system. If you ever want to do some work for pdfChip, check out the build system as well. There is a presentation that I gave at the together with Olaf from Callas at the VIP event earlier this month, if I'm not mistaken. Then that also talks about the build system for pdfChip. Those presentations and videos will be posted online at some point as well. But that build system is really nice for that. So we have Sublime. Let's talk about folder structure. Now, this is typically what you end up with. And let's actually open this up in Sublime and look at one of these things. So all of these are templates that I have created for this presentation. And what you can see in there is a bunch of folders. I have index.html at the highest level that is required. That's the file that pdfToolbox will look for and start converting. And then I have styles, scripts, images, and something called callas_temp. Now, what is important is that there really are no conventions. Index.html has to be there, and for that one, the name is important. All of these other folders, you do whatever you want to do. If you look at my index file in this case, it picks up the style sheet and it picks up the JavaScripts that I'm going to need at some point. But it does that simply in the way that you would do in HTML. I refer to pick this up from the same location as the HTML file and then a folder called scripts. I could just as well call that someone else. So you call all of these elements what you want. The only thing that is required is index.html. And then the other thing you need to know is that this callas_tmp file or folder, you will not have that when you start building a place content template. So that is something that is created by pdfToolbox itself the first time that you run a the fix-up that uses this template. So initially you will not have that. You can have a look at what is inside of there. Initially you will not have that, but it will be created automatically by pdfToolbox the first time that you run this place content fix-up. And that's important. So if I go back to how I would create this in pdfToolbox, I would say create fix-up. We have to look at place. If I could type, that would be so much better. We have to go to place content, and then place content expects a folder in that folder with configuration files, and that is stored in your current library. So different libraries may have different collections of HTML templates. So I need to select a folder here, and then when I run this fix-up, pdfToolbox will, inside of that folder, create this callas temp subfolder for me. Do you need to know that Yes, you do. That's a very useful folder that is created in there. What it creates is the two most important files in there are a pdfchip.log file. This refers to pdfchip. I know we're working with pdfToolbox as a product, but pdfchip, the product that Callas has to convert HTML templates into good production-ready or archive-ready PDF, is actually part of pdfToolbox. And it is the pdfchip technology that is used for place content. So this is the log of the execution of that place content template. And then the other file that is very important is this calls.docinfo.js file. That is a JSON file that is automatically created by pdfToolbox, and that contains information about the file that I'm processing. Right? So whenever you process a file with that fixup, with a place content fixup, Callas will create the subfolder, create that JavaScript file with information about your file, and then it will start converting your index.html. Why is this important? Well, it's important because it describes a lot of things about your file that you can use during the conversion process, and that means that I can simply include this in my HTML file. So I know that whenever pdfToolbox is going to convert this index.html file into PDF, it is first going to create this calls.docinfo.js file. So I can include that in my HTML, and I can use information from it, such as the size of the trim box, for example. I can use information from that JSON file in my HTML template. That's how this all fits together. So let's go back to my presentation for a second. So that's the folder structure in there. Then you create a fixup as we just showed, and then we point to the folder that is that we just created in there. The name of the folder itself for the templates is not important. If I, well, it is important and not important. So this name, 01, for example, Callas doesn't do anything with that except for showing it in pdfToolbox. So when I go to my fixup again and I say edit for one of those fixups, the names of the folders will show up in this list, but other than that, they're not used. They won't end up in the final production file in some way. So there is no, you can name them whatever you want. You don't have to feel restricted in naming those. Okay, so what have we seen so far? We've seen that you preferably should not use HTML templates if you can avoid it, that we can use Sublime to make our life a little easier, or you use your preferred text editing system or IDE to do that, and then how this place content fixup actually works, and what kind of information you find in an HTML template. Now, there's a few other tricks, and these are, I've made a selection. There is probably more that we could fill in or put in this section, but I made a little bit of a selection. There's a few things that you can do to make your life easier. We're using HTML technology here, and when you're here, that probably means that you have some understanding of using HTML and JavaScript and CSS to create web pages, for example. That's the typical use of all of these technologies, of course. There is a difference between using HTML for the web and using HTML inside of the Callas technology. And this remark is actually the same for pdfchip, for place content inside of pdfToolbox, for pre-flight reports based on HTML in pdfToolbox, and some other places where the same HTML template technology is used. So there's a difference between the web and between that. On the web, you typically want to have very robust HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code because you don't know what environment your HTML is going to be used in. It can be used on different platforms and different browsers. It can be used for different purposes. It can be viewed on a huge monitor or on a cell phone. So you have to write code that can handle all of these different situations. That is typically exactly the opposite of what you have with pdfToolbox and templates in pdfToolbox. Why? Well, you know what the engine is going to be. The engine is a WebKit derivative inside of pdfToolbox, and it's not going to change. So there is no variability there. And secondly, and very importantly, typically you know what you're doing in terms of the output size. You want to typically decorate PDF files in much the same way. Yes, the size of the PDF file may be different, but you're typically adding elements that are consistently the same size. And you always want them in the same positioning, typically. So where, for example, they teach you not to use tables on the web and not to use things like absolute positioning when you're writing for the web, and your code has to be responsive and so on. When you're working with pdfToolbox, you can forget about almost all of those things. It's a different world. And forgetting about that, making that click that this is different, is actually going to help you. Now, these tips continue to work on that same theme. It's a few things that you can do to make your life easier as you're developing these templates. So let me go through this. First of all, as you probably know, all HTML elements have margins. And the default margins for HTML elements are typically not what you want anyway. And that's true even for the web. But on the web, zeroing everything and then inserting your own margins for everything can be a bit of a hassle. Here in pdfToolbox templates, you're actually better off if everything has a margin and a padding that is 0, and then you set those margins and padding values that you need. I'm going to talk a little bit more about margin and padding in a second, and the difference between those two. So I'm going to skip that here. I'm simply going to tell you that there is a very easy way to zero out all margins, and it's by using CSS. And the CSS code that you see there will actually do it for you. That asterisk that you see there is a universal selector that selects all elements in your HTML, and for all elements it sets the margin and the padding to 0. And from that point on, you can have other rules in your CSS that set the margin to specific values for the elements that need margins and paddings and so on. So that's one thing. The second thing is background colors. Very often when you work with PDF documents and you're working with this place content technology, you're going to add elements onto a production PDF file. So that PDF file might be PDFX compliant, or at least you want to make sure it only contains CMYK. And the fact that you start from HTML makes it easy to trip up if you want. You don't probably want RGB introduced in those files. Now, pdfToolbox CSS has ways to use CMYK and so on, so all of that is not that much of an issue. But what is very easy to forget is that everything also has a background color in HTML, even the body element, which is the main element in your HTML file. And if you don't do anything, the background color will be white, and even worse, it will be RGB white. That's probably not what you want. So again, you can fix that, and the two CSS rules that you have there are equivalent. The top rule is again with this universal selector and sets the background color of everything to transparent, which is probably not a bad idea, specifically in a in a template inside of pdfToolbox. The second rule is an alternative that is a little bit more cautious. That one only looks for the body element and then sets the background color of the body element to transparent. Most other HTML elements already have a background color that is transparent, so you don't need to worry about that too much. The body element usually has white, RGB white, so that fixes that particular problem. You can use either of those. I have a tendency of using the second alternative because it feels safer. It's probably too cautious, to be honest. Again, once more, don't go telling people that work for webs that make websites, for example, that I've told you that these are things you need to use in your website. That is not the case. But for pdfToolbox or PDF chip development, I would definitely advise these. And then we come to boxes, and this is, I think, the last tip I have in here, and then we'll make some templates. When we come to boxes, you have to realize, and again, this is one of the things that can be really hard if you're not really used to working with HTML. You have to realize that everything in HTML is a box. Every HTML element essentially is a box, and what the browser does when it's laying out HTML for you is it stacks those boxes in some way. So it takes all of these boxes and it stacks them, and each box has different properties, and you see them there on screen. There is the element itself. This could be text, for example, or it could be an image, or it could be whatever you want it to be. Then you have padding. You have a border, that's that ugly green thing that I have in there, and then there is a margin. And all of these things can have a different width and height. So the element itself has some physical width and height, of course. If it's text, that's typically the bounding box of all of the characters. And then you can specify padding, you can specify a border, and you can specify a margin around that. And the margin is not that outer line that you have there, this outer border. That's not the margin. The margin really is that whole white section that you see there. Why is that one white and is padding purple? Well, it's actually important. When you specify padding for an HTML element, that area around the element will be colored with the background color of your element. So if I have a text line and I set the background element of my text line to purple, then the padding that I specify for that text line will also be colored with a background of purple. The margin is not colored with the background color. It's an important distinction, and it's very useful to start working with to determine whether you want something that is transparent or you want something that has the same background color as your element. Something that I don't mention in here when we start talking about width and height, and I think that's the next slide actually, we start talking about width and height, you can set these things in millimeters. And where normally that is not something you would do on a website, of course, again, for these types of templates that we're talking about here, using millimeters makes a lot more sense than using pixels or any of the other values that you have. You can use inches as well, by the way, so it's not geared towards Europe. But use these absolute measurements instead of using something like M or pixel or whatever. Now, what is important here is, and what you see here on screen, is that an element has a width and a height. And if you specify the width and height of an element, that kind of makes sense that it has a width and a height, right? If you specify that width and height, so if I take a text line, a text element, and in my CSS I specify that the element should be 2 centimeters high and 5 centimeters wide, then the width and the height is used to set the size of the element itself. So the text line itself will be 2 centimeters by 5 centimeters as indicated by those arrows. But that will not include the padding, the border, and the margin that you have around that element. And that's a little bit weird, and it can be very annoying when you start doing calculations, because it would mean that I could calculate a layout, I could set up width and height to 2 centimeters and 5 centimeters for a particular text line, and then at some point my client says, oh, I would want this text line to have a small border, for example, of 1 millimeter. Well, at that point, the height of my text line will be 2 centimeters plus 2 millimeters. 1 millimeter for the top border and 1 millimeter for the bottom border. So what you set in terms of width and height does not include all of these other things. And if you think of it, that's a little bit weird. And it's not always convenient. You can make it more convenient, and that is by adding some CSS. And again, I use the universal selector to apply this to everything in my HTML. And there is a CSS tag that is called box sizing. And that is set to, when you set that to border box, then what you get is actually this situation. And now you can think of this as a physical box. I have a box that is 2 centimeters by 5 centimeters. And then depending on how thick the actual material of the box is, the border and the padding if you want, my element will have a size that is slightly smaller than this 2 centimeters by 5 centimeters. So it works differently. And what I find, again, your mileage may vary, but what I find is that using this trick makes it more predictable to start creating complex templates and put a lot of stuff together on the page. So remember that you can do that. Okay, so then we're done with these tips, and it's time to look at an actual template. And I'm going to do a lot of this stuff in Sublime to show you what is going on here. Before we get started, what I'm doing here is I'm building a number of different templates, and you can see this goes from 01 to 09. In pdfToolbox, I have fix-ups from 01 to 09. You can forget about the add barcode. I don't even know why that is here. So I have a range of different fix-ups in there, and each of them is trying to make a point. And now this is not an interactive session, so I will ask questions, but it's going to be really hard for you to answer. But I'm going to ask them anyway so that you can think about what the answer is going to be, and then I'll show you why you are wrong, or maybe right. If you know a little bit about HTML and CSS, it might be easier than I imagine it to be. So let's get started with example number 1. And this is an empty framework, if you want, just to show how this technology works, and it will be already a little bit surprising, I think. This is a very simple template. I don't even need these script files in here. They're not used at the moment. The important file in here, in all of my examples, is a script.js. That is the script file where I start my own scripting usually. That is empty right now, so we don't use scripting in this template. I do use an index.html, and that one has one text element, a paragraph. And then I use this styles.css file, and the only thing that you find in there at the moment is these cleanup tricks that we talked about already. So the universal selector, and then I have margin and padding set to 0, box sizing set to border box, and like I said, I prefer the alternative where I use body and I have background color transparent. If you want to see the other option, I could also do this. So I could add this to my universal selector and then simply remove that in a way that looks even simpler. So you can use both of these. So this is a very simple HTML file, and what I expect, and let's see if we can open this up here. So what I have is at the top of my HTML file, I have the word penguins, and that's it. So what will happen if we do this in pdfToolbox? We go back here. I have a really big file. It's called really big file. So that's what it is. Look at the measurements that I have down here. It's 1 meter by 1 meter, and then I have 2 centimeters of bleed around it as well. So the total size here is 104 by 104. It is a really big file because I want to be able to show the effect of adding our templates to it. I want to make sure I can show you why things happen, so that's why I have a really big file on there. I have the penguins on there because I'm slightly obsessed by penguins. That's something completely different, but it's important in this case that it's pretty big, and I'm going to run this, save it to my desktop, and then let's give it a number. Maybe we can still refer to it afterwards. So I'm just going to save that. So remember what happens now. pdfToolbox starts doing this. It creates that subfolder callas temp, and in there that calls docinfo.js file. That JS file gets included in my HTML. I don't do anything with that at the moment, but it does get pulled in there. And then the HTML is converted into PDF, and something happens to my file. And you can see that something happens. I don't know how many of you predicted that the word penguins was going to show up somewhere, well, somewhere along this file. I think many of you expected that what I see here in my HTML, and that is the word penguins at the top of the HTML file, that would also mean that the word penguins would end up at the top of my PDF file, and that is not the case. And we need to understand why it is not the case, because it is essential when you start to try doing something with place content. What is in here, and by the way, I can already see that I'm not going to make it by 5. I apologize, but I think this is important enough to spend some time on. What you can see here is that I'm using template 1. That's the one we just looked at in Sublime. And then I do the positioning of what gets created in here as well. So I'm saying take the lower left corner of the media box. That's this corner here at the bottom of my PDF. So the lower left corner of the media box, and position what gets created in relationship to that point with a horizontal offset and a vertical offset of 0. So basically, convert the HTML template into a PDF, take this PDF that gets converted, place it in the lower left corner of my media box. Now that's exactly what got done. And why then does the word penguin end up where it is? Well, this is probably the most important point that you have to remember from all of this stuff with templates. There are 2 coordinate systems at work here. The first one is the PDF coordinate system. PDF files have a coordinate system that starts in the lower left corner and it runs to the right and up, meaning that if I place something at an X or horizontal coordinate of 5 centimeters, it will be placed starting in the lower left corner of the PDF, 5 centimeters to the right. If I place something vertically 5 centimeters from the origin, it will be placed 5 centimeters vertically up from the origin, from the lower left corner. In HTML, the coordinate system is completely different, interestingly enough. Well, not completely. The x-axis runs in the same direction. It goes from left to right. But the y-axis, the vertical axis, runs from the top left corner and then downwards. And that may sound complex, but it's not. That's what we see. If I select this HTML file and I open it up, then the word penguins appears in the top left corner. That makes total sense. The top left corner is the beginning of the the coordinate system in HTML. But you have to remember that that is not the same for PDF. PDF starts at the opposite corner, at the lower corner. Now, why does the word penguin end up somewhere in the middle? Well, what you're doing is you're taking an HTML file and you're asking pdfToolbox to convert that HTML file. Now, we're not really used to thinking about page sizes when we talk about HTML. Usually, HTML is displayed on the web. There is not really a page size on the web. We simply scroll, we adjust sizes of browsers without thinking about it. The HTML adjusts itself. But in this case, again, we're doing something different. The technology is different, and we are using page sizes here. We're taking the HTML file and we're converting it into a PDF document. A PDF document has to have a page size. Now, our CSS file that we have here does some cleanup, but it does not specify a page size, nowhere. So what page size does pdfToolbox use? Well, it turns out that it uses a default page size. If you don't specify what the page size is, then pdfToolbox says, well, I'll have to use whatever I think makes sense. And the default page size that pdfToolbox uses is always A4. So 29.7 centimeters, by 21 centimeters. That is the default page size that is used. So basically, what comes out of this conversion of this HTML is a page that has a transparent background and has a size of 29.7 centimeters by 21 centimeters. And what we're saying in this fix-up is position that thing that was used in the lower left corner. And that's exactly what pdfToolbox does. It places a A4 page in the lower left corner of that document. And that means that penguins ends up about 30 centimeters up from the origin. The origin is here at the bottom. Penguins is at about 30 centimeters. The whole document is a meter, so that's about right. It's about a third of the whole document. Yeah. I'm going to go through a number of other steps to make you understand what this page size is and how you can get this correct. But this is really crucial when you start thinking about how to make templates. Now, there is one question that I want to talk about very, very briefly. Who was it again? Axel. It would be nice if pdfToolbox could see as wireframe. Well, pdfToolbox can see as wireframe, but it doesn't help you much in this case because what you have here is a text line. There is no background element in that page size, in that HTML that we converted, so you don't get a margin here. It's just the only single text line that is generated, and that gets added to the PDF. So it doesn't help as much, but we'll do some experiments that show what is going on here. So let me restart with my really big documents. And now I'm going to use template number 2. And in template number 2, I have nothing. I have an empty file. So my HTML file is empty. What you have to realize is that it's not really empty. There is still a body element, and a body element is just as good as real elements inside of it as far as HTML is concerned. And I still have some styling that is done to the body element in this case. And what happens here is that instead of doing background color transparent, I've on purpose set it to pink, which is a very ugly RGB pink that is generated. And if I open this up in a browser, this is what you get. And I wanted to include this because this is not going to do what you expect in pdfToolbox, and I just want to make sure that you understand that that's normal and you shouldn't worry about that. So I'm simply going to convert that to PDF again and add it to my really big file. And what happens in this case? Well, nothing happens. You can see that nothing was actually changed to this PDF document. And the reason for that is because of optimizations that happen in pdfToolbox, where that body element is shown in HTML, so a browser would show it in pdfToolbox. Because the rest of the file is empty, it is simply optimized away. So something like this does not work in pdfToolbox. Just remember that. It saves you trouble by thinking that you've done something wrong. So we're going to go to number 3. I have presentations that go along with this, but they don't have that much information, so I'm just going to do it all in pdfToolbox. Let's go to fix-up number 3. Fix-up number 3 uses template number 3. That kind of makes sense. Template number 3 introduces an element again because the empty file didn't work, so we're introducing an element again. This time it's a div. A div is a container, basically, and that div gets an ID of background. If you're not very familiar with CSS and HTML, an ID is typically a way to refer to the element afterwards. So if I now look in styles, you'll see all of my cleanup code. That's this section that is highlighted now. And then there is something new for page rule, and then there is something new here at the bottom. So what did I add? Well, first of all, I've added a page rule. I told you that the reason we end up with an A4 file before is because there was no page definition in my HTML file. Well, a page rule is a way to specify a page definition and a page size if you want. And page size here is set to 25 by 25 centimeters. And that means that now the size of the PDF that we generate from this HTML will be 25 by 25 centimeters. pdfToolbox also has ways of allowing you to set an explicit trim box and bleed box and so on. That makes a little bit less sense here than it does in PDFchip. Here it is mostly the size of the file that is important. And then at the bottom, this pound sign is a way to refer to an element with an ID. So basically this rule says look for the element with ID background. If I go back to my index.html, that means this div. That one is the one that has an ID background. And then I set the background color to pink, and I set the width and height to 25 centimeters. A div is really a container, and normally a div takes its width and height from the elements that are inside of it. We don't have any elements inside of it, so that would mean the div by itself is empty and we wouldn't see anything again. I've given it an explicit width and height in this case. So our page is 25 by 25, and we have one container in it that is 25 by 25, and that has a background of pink. So while I am running this, think in your head about what's going to happen, what is going to get added to this fix-up, and where. So that I don't cheat, I will show you what the settings are. I'm positioning this in correspondence to the trim box in this case, and I'm saying vertical and horizontal offset is 0. Right? So you know what's going to happen. And if you don't, I'll show you. We'll call this 3, and then a pink box gets added. I hope this is what you were expecting, because I've given away all the clues beforehand. So basically, what we asked pdfToolbox to do was convert that HTML. The HTML contains a page rule that says the page should be 25 by 25. The HTML contains a box that is 25 by 25 that has a pink background. So the whole page is basically covered by that pink box. And then I position the result of that, so that 25 by 25 centimeter file, in the bottom left corner of the trim box. And that's what I get. Remember, the whole file is a meter by a meter, so this box would fit 4 times horizontally and vertically in my PDF document, right? So that's really cool. That gives us a way to create an element of a given size and then make sure that we can position it where we want. Of course, there is a slight problem with this approach. I know why I've used a div in here and given it a specific size, specific width and height. And that is because if I have an element that has a specific width and height, I can make sure that my page definition in CSS has exactly the same width and height. And then I have no problems. I can position this with the properties in the fix-up, and it will end up where I want it. So let me give you another challenge. To reopen my file here, go to number 4, and in number 4, I haven't made that many changes. I still have an element called, or with an ID that is background. But now it's a text line. So what is the size of a text line? Well, that's difficult. It depends on the point size that I'm using. It depends on the font that I'm using. So that's a little bit more difficult if you want. And if I look at styles, I can try to make this work. So now I have my text line that has a background color. I set a pretty big font size. This is a trick to make it behave a little bit nicer. I can explain later what exactly that does. And I have still my page size of 25 by 25, right? So you should be able to predict what's going to happen here. I'm just going to run this. Of course, what we're trying to do is we're trying to have a simple text line that gets added somewhere, and we try to get to a situation where we can predict where that is, and we can align it in different corners of the trim box or the bleed box or the media box, for example. Now what I do here is I still align it based on the trim box. So if I run that, you could expect that there is a file that the text line is going to be added at the bottom left corner of the trim box. But of course, that's not going to happen. Our text line ends up somewhere in the middle of the file again, or at 3/4 of the file to be exact. Why? Well, you should have seen this one coming. We convert our HTML. Our HTML has a page rule that says 25 by 25 centimeters. So the PDF file that pdfToolbox comes up with is 25 by 25 centimeters. And then, yes, there is a text line at the bottom, at the top, sorry, of that HTML file, but that gets converted to the top of that PDF and then added to my larger PDF file. So I still don't have this text line at the origin of my trim box here, which is really what I want. So because of that page rule, it doesn't work, right? That this is not the effect that I'm looking for. So we need to try something else, and trying something else means restarting with my really big file, going to a new template, and no changes here. I still have the same text line that I attempt to position, and now I have made one change in my CSS. Of course, the fact that I had this 25 by 25 centimeter rule was annoying and doesn't give me the result that I want, so I simply removed that. So what's going to happen now? Well, you should know. I've given you all the information you need to figure it out. Make a bet with yourself on where that text line is going to end up now. There is no price. But if it's not there, then you were wrong. Yeah. Why does it end up there? If I would show you the other file, number 4 file, you'll see that it's a little bit higher than on number 4. Why is that? We did this as the first or the second exercise. Actually, I don't specify a page size in my CSS. Not specifying a page size means pdfToolbox will generate the default page size, which is A4. A4 is 30 centimeters as opposed to the 25 we had before, so our text line ends up a little bit higher than what we had before. So now we have a problem. What I have just shown you is that if we have a fixed page size in there, it doesn't work because, well, I have this fixed page size, and that's not good for aligning elements, especially not when we start aligning stuff at the bottom and at the right of our file. If I would have selected top left, then there would never have been a problem. My text line would always have ended up in the top left corner. Yeah, but if you want to align something in the center or in the right or at the bottom of your HTML, your PDF, sorry, then you have these issues. Now, what I just showed you is that if I have a page rule, remember this one, if I have a page rule in there, it doesn't work because my page is much bigger than the text line that I'm adding, so that's not going to work. If I remove the page rule, it doesn't work either because removing the page rule means use the default, and that's A4, so that's definitely not good. So how can I get around this? The very naive way of getting around it is saying, well, I'll need to figure out how big my text line is. And then I simply insert a page rule that is as big as my text line. So I could start measuring. And I could say, do this once, print it out, measure that I have 0.5 centimeter by 3, well, it's going to be more, probably 10, 12 centimeter. Yeah, so you measure that, and then you change your CSS to 12 by 0.5 or 0.5 by 12, whatever the 12 by 0.5 in this case. That sounds like a bit of a hack if you ask me. Because that would mean that you would need to create this template, you would need to measure afterwards how big the text line is, then you have to change the template. At some point you want to change the font, and you can start over because then the text line is a different size, and it's a recipe for a disaster. Even worse, I'm adding a fixed text line here, and yes, I can measure that. What if I want to add the names of the separations in this file? Those are going to be different every time. So there is no way to know how big that text line is going to be. I can only know on the fly, right? So we need a better solution than this. And it's going to require some JavaScript because there seems to be no way to solve this with a static CSS file. Whether I have a page rule or not, doesn't make a difference. It's always wrong. So we need to use some JavaScript. And that's what I'm doing in the next template. If I go to number 6, still says adjust page size. Now, this one looks exactly the same. I have my text line. And this one looks exactly the same as before. So I think we just set ourselves up for failure, right? Because the HTML and the CSS are no different. But luckily, there is one change change, if you go to script.js, there is now actually a script part to this template, and it's the script that is going to save us. How? Well, this script contains something called cchip print loop, and that is a predefined function. If you have that in a JavaScript file, and if that JavaScript file is included in your HTML, and it is here. So if you have that function, it will be called automatically by pdfToolbox. And pdfToolbox runs the code that is in here. And then when I also have print pages somewhere, that is the point where my page is executed. Now, when I need to do this, when I use this JavaScript in this way, I have a couple of different things I have to do. I have to define the print loop function. At some point, I have to call print pages, or else nothing is going to be output. And I need to do that for all pages in my document. pdfToolbox is going to convert my file, and then I use this print loop to add the elements to every page of the original PDF file that I'm processing. How do I know how many pages there are? Well, look at this calls.info pages length. What that means is get the length, so the number of elements in the pages array in calls.info. Calls.info is, when I'm in here, calls.info is this here, this variable that gets automatically generated a pdfToolbox when the template is converted, and that has all the information about the PDF file that we're processing. There is a pages array in here. This one has one element in it, this element. So that means that there is one page in my PDF document that I am processing. Yeah. So this file is this calls.info that we added, and we use that to make this page loop. And then there is one utility function that I'm using, and you can either try to figure out how to do this yourself, or you can use a file that I've created and that you have as an example in many of the templates that come with pdfToolbox. That file is called fp_place content support. It's not the best name. We'll rename it at some point. That file is a relatively long JavaScript file with a bunch of support functions in it. And what we are using here is a function called adjust document size to HTML element, and then that takes the ID of the element that we want to use. And what I do in my script is very simple. I look for the element that has an ID of background, and I ask my JavaScript to insert a page rule in my CSS dynamically, and the page rule that it generates will set up the page size to be exactly the same as the size of my HTML element. Yeah? So instead of having a fixed page rule in CSS, I am generating that page rule in my JavaScript. So now pdfToolbox will generate a PDF file of which the media box size is exactly the same as the size required by my paragraph. And the size required by my paragraph, that is determined by the WebKit browser inside of pdfToolbox. And that can also be dynamic. So if I change this dynamically, if I would make a list of separations in this file, for example, and I ask for the width and height of that element, I am going to get the exact width and height I need for that string with all the separations in it. So that's a dynamic thing that is happening. And that means, look at the settings for number 6. I'm saying trim box, upper right corner in this case. That's kind of weird. Let's take the same first, lower left corner. And let's run that. And I place that on my desktop. I get my text line in the lower left corner of the trim box. If you use this trick with this JavaScript, then you can add whatever element you want, and the size of the generated file, the size of the generated PDF file, will always be the size of that element that you specify. And then you can use the positioning that you have in here to determine what's going to happen. So if I say upper right, and I run this again, and we'll just overwrite what we have here, then it's now going to be positioned in the upper right corner. So then those positioning things are going to work correctly. And I'm doing this with a text line, but this could just as well be a div with a whole bunch of elements inside. And then the size that is calculated will be of that div with all of the elements inside. If it's an image, it will be the size of the image. Yeah. So that's a really nice trick of doing that. Now, the next example is, what if I want to do multiple, if I want to place that multiple times? So I not just want to have text here in the lower left, but I want it multiple times. Well, you don't always need to make a new template for that. And let's switch to list view. I can simply use the same place content template a couple of times. So the template that is used here is 0.6 in all 4 cases, but the positioning is different in this case. So if I run this, and we call that 7, if we run this one, that text line will be added in all corners of the PDF document that I have, but I only have one template. I simply call it a number of times. Now, you already see part of the problem there. I just quadrupled the time it took to add these text lines because I'm actually calling this PDF chip template inside of pdfToolbox 4 times, each time with the same template, but then I put it in a different location. So that's maybe not ideal. Also, I'm placing the same thing on all 4 corners. What if I wanted to place different items on those 4 corners? I would have to make 4 different templates. So it's not an ideal solution. Sometimes it's really helpful, especially if you have the same element that you want to place in multiple locations. It can be a nice way of doing things, but it would be nice to be able to place different elements in different locations on the file without having to have this way of using that template more than once, right? And how can we do that? Well, it turns out there is also a really nice way of doing that that is not much more complex than before. I'll show you what happens first. So multiple elements with one template is this example, and then save it on my desktop. We're almost there, by the way. Save it on my desktop, and there we go. So now I have left top, left bottom, right top, right bottom. So I have different text, but I only have one template that is being run here, template number 8. And the position, strangely enough, is the media box lower left corner of the media box. Yeah, but still, my text lines end up neatly positioned on the trim box. Now, there is a whole bunch of JavaScript code behind the scenes to do this. Fortunately for you, it can be relatively simple. I have a text line here. And if I look at styles, there is nothing special, nothing changed actually. Well, one thing changed. I removed the pink background because I think it's ugly. But in the script, it is a little bit different. And actually, I think I showed you something wrong here. There are, of course, 4 different text lines in this case. That would be kind of strange otherwise. So there are 4 different text lines, This one has an ID of LT, an ID of RT, an ID of LB, and then RB, and then they all have a class. If you're not very familiar with CSS, the difference between ID and class is that they can both be used to address them in CSS. So in this case, I'm looking for an element that has a class, that's the dot, that is background, and ID was a pound sign. So here I refer to objects with a class. The difference between the two is that there can be, or there should be, only one element with an ID of LT. IDs are supposed to be unique. There can be many elements that have a class background. So class is typically used to specify a style if you want. An ID is used to uniquely identify a particular object. So my CSS looks a little bit different because I have this class reference instead of an ID reference. My HTML looks a little bit different because I have 4 text lines, but the script is what looks the most different. It is not that much more difficult though. What I have here is still very similar. I have a page loop that loops over all pages of my input file. I only have one file, one input page in this document, so it's not going to have much work. But if you have a 1,000-page document, it's actually going to loop 1,000 times and then do these things 1,000 times. And then what this does is it's also one of those utility functions. In this case, also a utility function in this place content support JavaScript file. And this utility function is setting the size of the generated PDF document to the size of the media box of the file that I'm processing. So the media box of my file here is 104 by 104 centimeters. Well, I'm instructing pdfToolbox to generate a PDF from my HTML that is also 104 by 104 centimeters. So the generated PDF file actually covers the complete media box of my original PDF document that I'm processing. And then I have another function in that place content support, and that other function allows me to do positioning, and that's where really the logic is done. So here I say, look for an element that has an ID of LT. Remember that that's one of these text lines. So look for that particular element and then position the left top of that element in relationship to the left top of the trim box on the document that I'm working on. So basically that puts this text line nicely in the corner of the trim box. And when you look at place content support, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but when you look at place content support and we look at position element, it will identify all of the parameters that you can use, and these are the positionings that you can use. So I can set something to the center in the middle, so center is horizontal, middle is vertical. I can set something in the corners of the document. I can set something in the center of the top of the document. I have 9 positions basically where I can position elements against, and I still have an offset to work with as well. So I could say place this in the lower left corner, which would be here, and then say I still want, so lower bottom corner is this one. I could say I still want 5. I would have to look what the unit is in this case. I think it's points. 5 points away from that point. So you can do very accurate positioning of these elements, and that makes it much more simple to have one template that positions multiple items on different areas of the page. Okay, so that was number 9, and then I have one more example that is really simple because it doesn't do much. I'm just going to run it and say desktop number 9. And that shows you that, yes, you can position something at the top, and you can do that without JavaScript, actually. So no JavaScript here, by using what is called absolute positioning. So position absolute, and then I have a position for the left of that element and a position of the top of that element. So that's going to work if you want to do something at the top left of your file, but again, as soon as you start doing something in other locations on the file, specifically things that are centered or in the neighborhood of the right-hand side or the bottom side of the document, and you don't know exactly what the size of your PDF file is that comes in, then this is not going to get you very far. So you can do these kind of positioning things yourself, especially if you know what the size of the incoming document is. But in general, the techniques that I've shown you to position something with like this, where you look at the size of the element, where you generate something that is the size of the element, or the technique where you generate a PDF that is the size of the media box, and then you use this positioning function to do everything else. Those techniques will make your life a lot easier in general. Okay, that's it for me for this time. I think there are plenty of other subjects we could talk about, and if you have ideas or things that you want to see, then feel free to bring them up. I'll look at some questions and see if I can answer those. So according to the fact that we have a callas temp folder, how does Switch manage this with concurrent usage? It's a good question. It means that there will be a new temp folder created. There is actually a copy of the complete template, HTML template folder that is created for each invocation in Switch. So there is not going to be overwriting or so on. So that's just going to work. There is no issue with that. Thank you, Jan. Jan tells me that Sublime is available not just for Mac, but also Windows and Linux. That's what I thought, but I wasn't sure anymore. Thank you. So that means you can use it on those platforms as well. Is there a way to get that callas docinfo file after debugging? And you found your answer, Tom, but it's useful for everyone. Yes. So basically, it's just written into that folder, and you can run the fix-up once, and then callas will write that JS file, that JSON file, and then you can open it in the text editor and see what is in there. It actually simply, and that's what I did here, this temp folder is simply created in there when you run this in pdfToolbox desktop, and that means that you can just go and look at what is in there. So that's not a problem. Then can you pass, I think I got that question yesterday as well, can you pass a path to the HTML template folder as a variable to pdfToolbox in the place content fix-up? That's a good question. I didn't get that yesterday. It's a different one. The answer, I believe, is no in pdfToolbox desktop. And I'm not even sure. I would actually have to look. I haven't thought about that one. So actually the answer is yes, there is a variable here. So that means that you should be able to use a variable, and the variable should evaluate to the path to the template folder. So I haven't tried this, Tom, but I believe the answer should be yes. It's something that I would need to try to make sure. But from what I see in the user interface, that should work. Then what else? Is that place content support file generated automatically and updated? No, that's a static file. It's a file that I wrote, and that once in a while we have a new version of. We're thinking of a way of versioning these files and putting them in a central repository where all of you would be able to access them. If you look at the standard library in pdfToolbox 9, there is a library that is called Shapes, Variables, JavaScript, and Place Content. In there, you have a number of example place contents, and many of these place contents, like place CMYK color bar and so on, those will actually include that JavaScript file, so you can pick it up from there. I will also try to include these examples in the download for this webinar. Can you pass in variables into the template from pdfToolbox? Of course you can, Tom. That goes without saying. We can do anything with variables. Let me open this one up. You actually have an area here where you can specify variables. And all of the other things can be variable as well, but you have a specific area here to set variables. If you have a variable here, or if this is part of a profile and you have a startup script for the profile where you define variables, then those will be passed along as well. If it's an invocation of the command line where you use set variable on the command line, those will be passed to the template as well. And actually there is, if I am not mistaken, if I go into scripts and I look at place content support, there is that might be a versioning thing. I think this is a relatively old file that I have here. If you pick up one of the more recent place content scripts, you'll find a section in there that deals with variables, where you have a function called getVariableValue, I believe, and you simply pass it the name of the variable, and that will get it. But basically, the variables are included in the JSON file. See this empty section here? If I specify a variable, then the variable name and value will be present in that JSON file. So you can pick it up from there. With number 8 sample, we might use some different images and place them onto the document rather than text. Yes, absolutely. So this will work for images and text. There's not really a difference. That number 8 sample uses that positioning, position object thing. So that's the one that uses position element. That works with any element. So if you have an image that has a specific ID, if this would be an image, then it will work with that one as well. Let me see. Could it be possible to download your test files? Yes, I will. I will try not to forget. If I do forget, send me an email, but I will try to include them together with the download on the website. So we have on our website, we have a place where we post these recordings under the support section. And typically you can also download the presentation from there. I will make sure that the test files are in there as well. And if I remember, I will include the most recent FP place content support file in there as well. Is there any way to get further info out of the PDF, such as XMP? For example, could we place the XML advertiser value on the page? That is a good question, and I'm thinking now. I believe there is a way, Tom, but I don't know it by heart. I need to look at it. But I believe there is a way to do this. You can certainly get to the document info. I am not sure anymore if this doc info would also include the metadata. So you can see that the document information is here. I don't think this will include the XMP information, but there might be a way to do it. I need to look into that one. I don't have a ready answer for that one. In the future, Are forms going to be supported by pdfChip? It's a good question. It's on our lists. I cannot give you a prediction. If you're interested in interactive forms, what would help me is if you could send me a short email with what exactly you are interested in, which features you would want, what you want to have supported. Then I can make sure that if we discuss this in development, that your questions are taken into account. Debugging in here, there is very little support for debugging other than the you would have to use with console log. For example, if you write something to the console, or if you there is a function for that. If you use debug log, which actually just uses console log, everything you write ends up in this pdfchip.log file. So that's one way of debugging. We're thinking of more support for debugging for these, but that's not included right now. How can I know which version of pdfChip is included? That's a good question. I think you will have to ask us, ask support, and we can figure it out. I don't think there is another way to do it. It doesn't seem to write it out in the log file. It's actually a good point. It should probably be written out in the log file somewhere. Can I create pages in my PDF? No, not with place content. You cannot do that. The only thing you could do is you could use some of the other fixups in pdfToolbox to add blank pages and then add stuff on there. But from a licensing point of view, if you start creating new documents, you should really be using pdfChip and not pdfToolbox. That's one of the big differences between the two. The other thing you cannot really do that easily is change the page size. It's really meant to decorate an existing page, not changing page sizes and so on and so on. Can we manage which image is used into the final page? I am not sure what you're referring to there, Pascal. You'll have to ask me through email, I think. XMP data here is not included, but I need to look at, I thought there was a way to get around that, but I'm not 100% sure. It's something that I need to look at. What you could do is you could generate the XMP. Well, no, I need to look at that one. I don't have an exact answer. What about HTML debugging? Yes, you read correctly that there is something for pdfChip with a Chrome extension. So there is a Chrome extension that allows you to debug HTML templates for pdfChip. You can actually more or less use that for pdfToolbox as well, but you would have to run your template once inside of pdfToolbox. That would give you access to calls doc info. And so on, and then you can take the templates and open the index.html file in Chrome and use the debugging in there. Just be careful in the fact that there are some differences between pdfChip and pdfToolbox, so you have to make sure that you use functionality that is available in pdfToolbox and not just in pdfChip. But that is certainly something that you can try to use here. Yeah, so if you have an HTML file with 3 different images in it and you want to determine which image is going to be used, the easiest way to do that, actually, if we take this index file, is to specify all of those images in your HTML. And in CSS, you can set them all to hidden. You simply show the one that is supposed to be shown, and then you use this position element to position that one that you want to be visible in the final PDF document. So that should definitely work. I'm using jQuery in here for most of these things as well. It's very simple in jQuery to hide or show an element, so you could use that technique to have only the image that you are interested in. Good. I think that's the last question I can see here. I hope I answered all of them. let me go to the last page of this so that you again have my email address on there. If there are any remaining questions, simply write me an email, and I'll be happy to go into more detail for different things. Meanwhile, short summary before we end this, almost half hour more than what I intended it to be, but I expected that. Short summary, we talked about when to use and when not to use HTML templates, some tricks in getting your your HTML a little bit streamlined for use in pdfToolbox, some additional stuff on setting this up in Sublime, and then a series of examples to talk about the coordinate systems and how you can make this work inside of place content. There are an amazing number of you still here. Thank you very much for that. I hope it was interesting. I realize that this is a rather technical topic and a quite complex one. So if you have ideas for a follow-up webinar where you would like to focus on specific techniques, for example, send me an email. Let me know what the things are that you would want to focus on. What we will also try to do is add this information to the documentation. So there is this new documentation website, help.callassoftware.com or hilfe.callassoftware.com in German. There is an English version and a German version of the documentation. On this site, you find a lot of interesting things for variables and so on, but place content is really underrepresented at the moment. We will try to add some more information about that on that help website as well. But if you have things that you want to focus on in a webinar, sometimes a webinar is a little bit easier to go into details than send me an email and let me know what you would want to do, and we can set up a follow-up webinar. Thank you very much. That's it from my side. The only thing that I'm left with is wishing you a very nice end of your day, and I'm sure I'll be seeing many of you back in the next webinar. Thank you.